This lecture is on color. So we'll focus in this class on two different color modes, CMYK and RGB, and some different types of color schemes like complementary, analogous, and monochromatic. And so we'll look at several of these within the lecture. Just the general thing to think about is, CMYK usually is created with ink for printing. RGB is created with light for any type of design for a screen, mobile or web, anything digital. Now, if we're familiar with the idea of color, we look back to our little color wheel from elementary school, how we were taught to mix paints and new colors. So traditional primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. Our secondary colors are equal mixtures of two primaries, which in this case is orange, purple, and green. And then we get tertiary or intermediate colors by mixing primaries and a secondary together to create those colors. So like red orange, yellow orange, red violet, blue green, those are going to be your tertiary or intermediate colors. So when we talk about RGB, this is how we see light. So traditional color wheels are useful for understanding how colors are mixed and related, but we need to focus on two different color models. So our color perceptions are based on the physics of how we see. There's three types of color sensitive cells called cones in our retina, and these three types of cones are optimized to respond to red, blue, and green light. So when we look at an RGB model, it's based on our human physiology. And this is how TVs and computer monitors create colors. This is an additive color model. We're adding the primary colors that will create white light. And what we're talking about is white light. The natural color spectrum or rays of light, our natural primaries are actually red, green, and blue. And when those red, green, and blue natural rays of light cross one another, that's how we get white light. And we can't really see white light. It's just kind of what we see around us. But that's perceived through those primary colors crossing one another, those natural rays of light in red, green, and blue. And the diagram here shows a color picker that can be accessed in Photoshop, InDesign, as well as Illustrator. And when you're in your color picker, you can look at the RGB codes. If you're using a specific branded color, you can punch in those codes and get the exact RGB color. And RGB can also be converted to a hexadecimal. You don't necessarily have to know that formula, but it gets really more detailed. Usually the hexadecimal code will have a hashtag in front of it, but it's located at the bottom of your color picker as well. Now, if we start with white light and subtract all the primary RGB color rays, you get the subtractive primaries. And these colors are the basis for color printing. Those are yellow, magenta, cyan, and of course black. Colors are printed by mixing different amounts of colored inks. Like I said just now, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So if we look at our color picker, those are based on percentages of those particular colored inks. And if we look at this diagram here, you can kind of see an example of how a four-color process works. So when we're printing on a press, we usually create screens, or we call them burning a screen, similar to screen printing for t-shirts and posters. And we basically separate those individual cyan, magenta, yellow, and black colors and just focus on the parts of those of the image that are within those color ranges. And they're printed individually, and then when combined, you get the overall image and all the colors showing through. And then we also have relationships based on the color wheel. Analogous colors on the color wheel are said to be are very harmonious. They tend to be similar and often work well together, and they're basically colors that are side by side on the color wheel. So if we were doing an analogous color scheme, we might choose blue-green, blue, green, and yellow-green. That were all kind of on the same side of the color wheel, side by side. And sometimes they share a hue. Complementary colors are those colors that are directly opposite from one another on the color wheel, like purple and yellow, or blue and orange, red and green, or in this case it's kind of a magenta like red. But those are going to be clashing colors. They're going to contrast, but they work well together. So we look to complementary colors a lot of times for team sports and school colors and things like that. That can carry over from warm to cool too. So half of the color wheel is warm, half of it is cool. So you could choose a warm color and a cool color, and they would always usually contrast with one another. And we also have tints, shades, and tones. So when we talk about hue, that is going to be pure color, just another word for pure color. Saturation refers to the amount of light or amount of light affecting a certain color under a particular condition of light. So you can think of saturation in terms of pale versus pure or weak versus strong. Brightness is similar, but it's also it's attributed to when a source appears to be radiating or reflecting light. But you can find the hue, saturation, and brightness in your color picker as well. And then we have tints, shades, and tones. A tint is when we add white to a color. A tone is where we add black to a color. A shade is where we add black to a color. And then tone is where we add equal amounts of black and white or gray to a color. So on the far left, we have the same kind of gold and orange, but just by adding white, black, and gray, we can create at least 15 variations of that color. So that lends a hand in creating color harmony in a layout. So you can create different tones of a given color. So in this case, they've started with the violet from a CMY color wheel. And the idea behind the tints is that you can add white to lighten the base color. And since we don't have white ink in process color, we can achieve that effect by keeping ink ratios constant while decreasing ink values. So this can also create shades of any color. In this case, we do this by adding black ink to the base ratio of CMY inks, and each row adds 10% black to the circle above. So in this color space, we see the most saturated color in the upper left corner, but as we move right, the color saturation decreases and gets more washed out, and as we move down, the color value increases, getting deeper, and as we move horizontally, we get more muted variations of the original color. The color wheel can be divided into areas. We have the cool colors, which are green, blues, and purples, and they tend to be calming, relaxing. There's a strong association with nature, like water, vegetation, or sky. And the ideas that are conveyed with nature and associated with nature is like simplicity, purity, cleanliness, ease, and peace. So notice the range within the cool colors. The blues with more red tend to have a touch of warmth missing from the blues. And in proximity to warm colors, cool colors tend to recede. Objects colored with cool colors may appear smaller when they're near warmer colors. So if we look at the symbolism, green, it's always been a color of vegetation and new life. We still relate green things to things relating to the environment or beneficial to the environment. It's very soothing, earthy, relaxing, color for humans. One of the reasons we love being outside instinctively. Cool colors also remind us of sky, water, and the heavens. In Egyptian and ancient Egypt, blue was considered a meaning of life and rebirth. So it's also calming to our system and a good color to counteract hypertension. So if we look at examples, blues can really work well in a layout to calm the senses and create a more calm aesthetic. And here in this example, we've used a warmer color for the shadowing, and it's also the complement to the green, and it contrasts well. Same in this image. We notice the blues, of course, and it's kind of an electric neon type of blue because it's all lit by light. But we have a little splash of red in here for a little contrast. This is a warm magenta. It's got more pink in it, or red, than it does blue. And warm colors, those are going to be our yellows, oranges, and reds. They tend to be exciting and energizing. And they can convey ideas ranging from optimism to anger to violence. And in a layout, usually the warm colors tend to jump forward, the cooler colors tend to recede. Warm colored shapes will appear larger than cool colored shapes in the same size. So warmer colors stand out a good bit more. Most people think red is the warmest color in the palette. It's actually orange. It's technically the warmest color in the palette. You're more likely to be stopped in a warm red car as opposed to a cool red car, like maroon, if you're stopped by the police. But in ancient Egypt, red was a color of life, victory. It's also been a symbol of anger and fire. We usually relate it to stop or danger or something toxic or harmful in some way. Yellow in ancient Egypt had qualities of being eternal and indestructible. It's a very strong color. It's a very energizing color. And combined with black, it gets a whole lot of attention. Mostly because in nature we usually see predators that have these colors in them, like a yellow jacket or a wasp or a tiger. In a housing crisis, some may perceive a realtor as somewhat of a predator. But if we look at some of these magazine layouts, we will see warm colors and the variations of these colors really make these elements pop on the page. With the tequila ad, we see the variations here created with adding black to these golden yellows for strong color harmony within the layout. Here we have these warm reds going on, but we have a cool neutral in the background, which helps it contrast. So given these examples of warm colors used well in the layout, here we have all the warmth of the pinks and the yellows and the oranges, and then the black is a cool black, again, to create more contrast. So when you're interacting and mixing warm and cool, you want to see a good balance there. And neutrals have a big part with that. But you have to think about, how do colors work together? What do they suggest? What do they convey? With some of these examples, relationships based on the color wheel, think about adjacent colors. They harmonize and tend to work similar. So you might want to, if you want those things in the elements, to do the same, then you might use an analogous color scheme. Here we're using warm and cool to create contrast. And then with the neutral colors, we have warm and cool neutrals as well. That helps us unify diverse color palettes. They affect and are affected by nearby colors, and they can also serve to focus attention on other colors. They can tone down colors that might be overpowering. But neutrals, generally, we're talking about black, white, gray, brown, ivory, beige, those types of colors. In ancient Egypt, black was the color of death and night. It's kind of a symbolization of self-confidence, power, strength. Darth Vader is a typical example of that. He's all black for the most part. But if he were a different color, he wouldn't have the same effect. But neutral colors, they help other colors pop. In this case, the red, when they're talking about head injuries in football. Here we've got this cool palette, and even the gray in the background is a cool. Everything's very harmonious and going well together. However, here we've got warm tones in the positive space here with the ribbon, and even the tans are warm. They have a little orange tint to them. But then we have this cool background neutrals that are helping with the contrast. And the warmer colors are popping forward. Here the tan, the color of the sand is quite warm. And then we have the pop of the blue as a complementary color. In this example, we've pulled from the images to create these varying neutral versions of the colors. So this blue, we muted it to create this more earthy tone of blue. It's more of a gray, blue-gray. We used this brownish color to create the parts of the head, and then we've got the drop cap and some of the labels down here. It's a variation of that brown. We also lightened it to the point where we're making this barely off-white color down here in the strip going around the page. And then the red spot colors are coming from the red in the socks. Here we have the warmer neutral with the cool color. So if you were looking at these examples right here, think about how you would describe this green in comparison with it on the yellow. But then if we look at it with the red and green, it just kind of hurts your eyes. You start to glare back and forth. It starts screaming at you, so to speak. That's known as simultaneous contrast, and we want to avoid that in color interactions. Here we see the same effect. If you notice, if you can guess which one has the simultaneous contrast. If you look, it's the yellow and the light gray here. And what creates that is if we were to change these colors to grayscale, this yellow would be the same level of value as this light gray. It would be almost the same gray. Same with the green and red here. If these were in grayscale, these would be close to the same gray. They're medium value. These are a lighter value. So it's important to think about color palettes when you are coming up with color interactions and various palettes to work with a brand or design. You want to alter the nuance and meaning of the design by applying different color palettes to see what works best. And when we look at something, nothing can create what we see with our eyes. I mean, nothing man-made. So the overall outside circle is our range of what we visibly can see in terms of a color palette or gamut system, our natural gamut system. Inside the yellow triangle is what a monitor, TV monitor or computer screen can capture. And then inside the blue triangle is the range of color that a printer can capture. So you can see it's a various difference. And a gamute system is basically colors that can be created by each system. So the switching to CMYK does not guarantee your printout will look the same as the image on the monitor. The monitor is always going to lie to you because sometimes you have to, that's why you have to test print and before you do a final revision. And the same goes for switching from RGB to CMYK. There's no guarantee that your image will look the same as it does on the screen. And that's because some colors in CMYK are not possible to achieve in RGB, and vice versa and conversely. So the gamute of a CMYK is not the same as a gamute in RGB. And every system has their own gamute system, like the Outlook web has their own gamute system. Adobe Color Creator has its own gamute system, and so forth.